Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for the staff and students at Queen Mary for coming, and for all the visitors who have come especially for this lecture tonight. My name is Matthew Hilton. I'm the new Vice Principal for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. I've actually only been in post for 4 weeks, so I'm not fully au fait with the procedures and the ceremonial aspects of this institution. But what I would say is that, given what I've been doing over the last 4 weeks, it is absolutely fantastic to at last be doing something which relates to what we're all here and are for and are about. This is my first intellectual event at Queen Mary, and I think it's an absolutely fantastic way to start with Elspeth's inaugural lecture, and particularly on a subject about which we all have an opinion at the moment, though I do not think we can all profess to have the same expertise as Elspeth in her lecture on Brexit and its consequences for the UK and EU citizenship. I should also say that this is the first time in over 25 years that I will have got to listen to a lecture by an academic lawyer. The last time was a series of lectures on introductory tort and contract law as an undergraduate student. I'm sure this is going to be a very, very different experience. And because of my lack of experience, I'm very pleased that I'm going to be able to hand over to Carol Harlow and to a series of experts who will form the discussants after the lectures, who will all have far more interesting things to say. So I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Carol Harlow as the Emeritus Professor of Law at the London School of Economics, who will be known to many of you in this audience. Amongst her most recent publications are Process and Procedure in EU Administration, and she's obviously had a long and distinguished career serving both public policy and also the Academy, not least through her role on such prestigious journals as the European Law Journal and Modern Law Review. So I will hand over to Carol now to do the more fuller introduction. Thank you.
Do these actually... Right. I'm not sure you need qualifications just to chair a lecture, and I too am extremely glad to hand over to the experts. But this important lecture takes place against an ominous background in which the chance of becoming an asylum seeker has risen to a level unseen since the end of World War II, when the international treaties which still have currency in the area were put in place. And alongside this, we have seen, or are beginning to see, a sharp diminution in the welcome accorded by European countries to immigrants of every sort, accompanied by an unwelcome rise in an aggressive form of nationalism. We know that immigration played a substantial part in the politicking that preceded the so-called Brexit referendum, a campaign which, in my view, was noteworthy for the absence of any reliable information on what the relationship between a member state and the European Union on immigration matters actually was. And we are therefore very fortunate tonight to have at our disposal several distinguished experts on the subject. I will turn first to Professor Elspeth Guild, whose inaugural lecture this is, and as you all know, it's entitled Brexit and its Consequences for the UK and EU Citizenship, or Monstrous Citizenship. Elspeth Guild is the Jean Monnet Professor ad personam at this institution and at the Radboud University Nijmegen, which I can never actually pronounce properly over the many years I've known Elspeth, in the Netherlands. She's also the visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges and associate senior research fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels. She practices what she preaches, as a partner at the London law firm Kingsley Napley, and she was she was also special advisor to the House of Lords European Union Committee's inquiry into economic migration in 2005. Elspeth has been working on asylum, immigration and border controls for at least as long as I know her, which is now many years, and her interests have fanned out to EU justice and home affairs generally. And she has published widely and edited several books on the subject, which we will leave on the back shelf for the moment. Elspeth.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you very much to my audience. It's very nice to see so many friendly faces out there, people who I have known for a very long time and who I have worked with for a very long time in respect of the issues that I'm going to talk about this evening. And I decided, I have been at Queen Mary now for 5 years, so it's a bit surprising to be doing an inaugural lecture. But we did get rather backlogged, and I arrived just as the backlog developed. So that meant that I only started to be harassed by the administration to do my inaugural lecture about 6 months ago. So to try and delay matters, I said, well, I'll do something on Brexit, but that means I can't do anything until after the end of June. So at the end of June, I had an email saying, yes, the referendum has happened, and we think that your date will be the 27th of September. So that was the end of my summer holidays, which I have spent writing about this subject. And I'm going to look at the question of Brexit, really from the angle of what it means for citizenship, for everyone who is currently an EU citizen. And I'm going to look at it from the perspective of what has happened in the context of from the events which led to the referendum to where we are now. And I'm going to finish with some comments on what is likely to happen, or what I see as the directions that we can see things going in already from the moment. So I'm going to start by explaining where I have looked at this, and there will be a published version of my inaugural lecture that should come out in about 6 to 8 weeks after I've had my comments and had a chance to revise it, so it will be there. The inaugural lecture examines the consequences of the UK vote on 23rd of June to leave the European Union, and those consequences on EU citizenship. The simple fact which appears to result from this vote is that within a fairly short period of time, not less than 2 years from the commencement of the departure procedure provided for in Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, British citizens will cease to be citizens of the European Union, while nationals of the other 27 will continue to have this status. Thus, nationals of the other 27 members will continue to have their citizenship rights, and British citizens will only have their British citizenship, which is based on the principle of allegiance to the sovereign, the foundation of state sovereignty, not the principle of rights as in the case of EU citizenship. And I'm going to develop that in the second section of my inaugural lecture. So what I want to examine is what is so terrible about these EU citizenship rights. And that's going to be the question which is at the heart of my lecture. The construction and image of the monster and the monstrous form my metaphorical frameworks to understand what happened to the EU project in the UK, which led to the vote in June, and what this means for all of us as citizens. St. George is the patron saint of England and that part of the UK whose people were decisive in determining the outcome of the 23 June referendum. St. George is normally portrayed slaying a dragon. He is the monster killer. Usually he's mounted on a horse and his lance is piercing the monstrous dragon which has been the cause of so much suffering to the people, the English. The image of the threatening monster is central to English religious identity, and the victory of St. George over his monster is a fixture of the socio-political landscape of England. There is a very famous mosaic in the central lobby of the Palace of Westminster, which meets every member of Parliament as they go in. What was this figure in the context of the Brexit campaign? The EU was presented as a truly monstrous entity. It was the dragon, sucking out of the British state sovereignty and enslaving the British people with its foreign laws. The vote to leave was presented as a vote for liberty and the independence of Britain, as opposed to remaining in the thrall of the monstrous EU. Yet when one steps away from the sacred image of St. George and his monster, and one examines the more secular monsters of our common mythology and the stories we tell our children, the picture is quite different. Europa and Zeus, in the form of her monstrous bull, are positive images which produce Europe. Beauty discovers the excellent qualities of her beast, and once kissed, the toad turns into a prince. Monsters can also be no more than our misunderstanding of the qualities of others. Returning briefly to the sacred imagery, the hero of St. George and the Dragon depends on the belief structure of the viewer. The tremendous popularity of the image of St. George in Haiti, as documented by the anthropologist Mitzel, resulted from the presence of the dragon, Damballa, the serpent spirit in Haitian traditional belief. In one form of the story, Damballa, through his sacrifice, becomes divine and thereby the great master who creates the cosmos. For the Haitians, the dragon was the venerated subject of the image, not St. George. The monstrous and the monster are frameworks of analysis which have been used by many social scientists to examine the citizen-immigrant divide. And I'm going to use Marina Warner's Managing Monsters Wreath Lectures of 1994 to provide me with a backdrop against which to look at monsters at the moment. I will also look into the question of the monstrous double, which is the monster who looks in the mirror and sees something so terrible that it must be destroyed, even though what it is in fact an image of the monster itself. I'm going to examine the monster and Brexit in 4 sections, and the first is going to be on the monstrous negotiations. On the 19th of February this year, an agreement was reached between the 27 member states and the United Kingdom in the form of an international agreement rather than a decision of the Council, the normal form for such agreements. The agreement set out what the EU would do to change itself and the rights of its citizens if the UK government would campaign in a referendum which it had championed and legislation for which it had led through the UK Parliament in favour of the UK remaining in the EU. And I will look briefly at how this extraordinary set of negotiations became monstrous or deformed the image of what negotiations among the member states and institutions are designed to be. How did we transform the constitutional structure which we had spent so much time developing about the negotiations and how the EU treaties are changed in one set of negotiations? Secondly, I'm going to look at monstrous citizenships. What is the UK's problem with EU citizenship? What does citizenship mean in the UK and the EU? And why is the image of one the monstrous reflection of the other? I'm going to examine British citizenship as a citizenship of obedience with limited and fluid rights, easily extinguished and increasingly difficult to acquire in a comparison with EU citizenship, as a citizenship based exclusively on designated rights set out in binding legal texts on which the holders are entitled to rely. I will examine to what extent it was these rights which became the monstrous element of EU citizenship, which was no longer tolerable and had to be extinguished. Thirdly, I'm going to look at citizens and their monstrous families. And here I'm going to look at the monstrous also as an element of contamination of the pure. In the 19 February 2016 statement between the British Prime Minister and the Council, one of the key successes of the UK government was agreement that if the referendum went in favour of the UK remaining in the EU institutions would change by highly dubious means the rights of EU citizens to be joined by their third country family members in accordance with the straightforward and fairly simple EU rules. So the citizens who were the objects of this effort by the British government were not primarily nationals of the 27 member states, but rather British citizens who moved to another member state to live and or to work and enjoyed family reunion with their third country national family members there. So long as they stayed in another member state, the UK government could tolerate this contamination. But EU law provides that after living or working in another member state for a while, the family is entitled to return home again under the simple, straightforward and cheap EU rules. These British citizens became the monstrous ones with monstrous families who get access to the UK through monstrous means which must be extinguished. In the fourth substantive section, I'm going to look at the problem of the monstrous fears. The referendum campaign in the UK was both led for the Remain and the Leave campaign by politicians who promised catastrophe, disaster and disorder to those who voted in the opposite way proposed by the relevant politician. Economic disaster was a favourite of the Remain campaign, social disaster in the form of uncontrolled immigration, the dog whistle for racism and xenophobia, was the big seller for the Leave campaign. Fears puffed up by rhetoric became the norm. Just as young people in particular enjoy being frightened by horror movies while at the same time claiming that the movie was silly and ridiculously unbelievable, so the British public began to amuse itself with monstrous fears. And the politicians leading the two campaigns became ever more extravagant in their fearful claims, as if daring the public to disbelieve them, as if the public were teenagers at the horror movies. Both political camps shared an anti-immigration argument, though in different intensities. In this section, I will examine how the fear of the EU citizen became the fear of uncontrolled immigration, and the effects this had on the negotiations. The antidote of fears is, of course, truth and transparency, little of which was on show during the campaign. Expert opinion, one of the modern forms of establishing truth claims, was ridiculed and denigrated, in particular by the Leave campaign. Informed policymaking was discarded, and expertise itself became portrayed as monstrous, constituting an obstacle to the maintenance of prejudice and intolerance. Expertise and experts became the dragon to be slain by the valiant St. George figure, driven by blind faith in the innate superiority of the British people. And I will conclude this examination of the monstrous Brexit debate with some reflections on where the UK may be going from here. The UK joined the predecessor of the EU in 1973 and has been somewhat of an uncertain party for a substantial period of time. I've been reading Dennis McShane. The turning point is really the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Labour government in 1997 comes in with a fairly strong pro-European perspective, and everything is soured by the failure, the French blocking the Security Council vote for the vote to go into Iraq. And that running sore of the continuing death and disaster that is occurring daily in Iraq and has done since the invasion continues to be part of this story, not least with the publication of the Chilcot Inquiry and the impact on a number of the Central and Eastern European countries, which were persuaded by the British government to join the coalition of the willing, and the consequences of the lies which appear to have been told in that respect. But from about 2003, we start moving into the territory of anti-Europeanism in all of the main political parties except the Liberal Democrats. Where did the idea for a UK referendum on EU membership come from? Well, it seems to have come from the then leader of the Conservatives, David Cameron, in the 22nd of January 2013, when he promised the UK public that if re-elected, he would call a referendum on continuing membership of the UK in the EU. His party had been in a coalition government with the pro-EU Liberal Democrats, and the wing of his party that was Eurosceptic had become increasingly unhappy with the uncertainty of Europe. When he was re-elected, much to his own surprise as well as that of many other people, on the 8th of May 2015, he delivered on his campaign promise, and in the Queen's speech on the 27th of May, the mechanism was put into place for a bill on the referendum to be put forward. At the European Council meeting, a couple of days before the Queen's speech, the Prime Minister began informal discussions with his counterparts, explaining he would be seeking a new arrangement and calling for a referendum. The legislation on the referendum was completed its passage through Parliament in December 2015, and the date, although it was much intended that the date would be in 2017, it was brought back to the 23rd of June 2016. Negotiations with the EU partners regarding the what would be the New Deal that would convince the Prime Minister to campaign in favour of the United Kingdom remaining in the European Union began from November 2015. Who could vote? Well, the British citizens who are on the electoral register, who haven't been outside the EU for more than 15 years. There was a Supreme Court challenge on that. Cypriot and Maltese nationals, EU citizens living in the UK because they're Commonwealth citizens and they're entitled to vote in national elections. And, of course, the age for voting was 18. In Scotland, at least, this was considered to be somewhat unfair, the exclusion of the 16 and 17-year-olds who had voted in the Scottish independence referendum 2 years earlier, on the 18th of September 2014, having been promised that if they voted to remain in the UK, that was the only way they could remain in the EU. But this time they would not be permitted to vote on whether or not to remain in the EU. What did the UK want from the EU? The Prime Minister has set out 4 main areas in which he wanted reform: economic governance, a greater role for non-Eurozone countries in Eurozone policy, competitiveness, the EU to do more to fulfill 3 of the 4 fundamental freedoms: sovereignty, that the UK should no longer be obliged to work towards ever closer union, and immigration. And immigration covered the heading almost exclusively of free movement of EU citizens. Entitling the section immigration, the Prime Minister expressly transformed EU citizens from citizens with the entitlement to move within the territory of which their citizenship applies, to immigrants who have no right to move, who are required to fill conditions, and to be subject to authorization or not from state bureaucracies on whether they can be there. So the change of language from one of entitlement and the rights of citizens to precarity and exclusion of foreigners is already at work in the very first letter of the Prime Minister to the Council. The Prime Minister wanted to find a new arrangement to allow a member state like the UK to restore a sense of fairness to our immigration system and to reduce the current very high level of population flows from within the EU into the UK. I'll come back to that in section 3. What happened in the negotiations? And here I'm not going to look in particular at the specifics, but rather how the negotiations developed and what the demands were of the UK and how they were met by the EU institutions. We have a series of exchanges of views and a number of meetings which take place between British officials and their EU counterparts, the Council primarily leading the delegation, the Commission providing the background, and the European Parliament something of a reluctant follower. When we have the first letter from the President of the Council, President Tusk, on the 2nd of February 2016, he reassures his colleagues that he did not cross a line where the principles on which the European project is founded were betrayed. And yet, what happened? When we get to the agreement, when we look at what was on offer, the Tusk package of instruments to address the UK Prime Minister's concerns about the need for a new deal for the UK within the EU became the subject of an exchange about the nature of the future deal. Various actors on the UK political scene apparently no longer trusted the EU institutions, the member states, and the legal structures to deliver a binding deal on which the UK could rely. One key actor in the debate, the former British Justice Minister Michael Gove, attacked the negotiations leading to a deal as failing to fulfill the promise of binding on the UK and the EU. The argument he put forward was that any deal, if adopted within the framework of EU law, would only be as binding as the political will of the EU. In his view, this would mean that the structure of the EU as a body governed by rule of law, with the Court of Justice as the ultimate arbiter of legality, meant the Court of Justice could overturn any deal as incompatible with EU law. His argument was that no deal was safe until it escaped the legal order of the EU and became impervious to a negative judgment of the Court of Justice. Further, the UK's need for speed, or else the Prime Minister would campaign to leave the EU, meant that either the EU institutions and the Member States had to respond immediately or face the consequences. The choice to respond immediately and agree a deal on 19 February, irrespective of the consequences for rule of law, now seems somewhat quixotic, as the British Prime Minister was unable to deliver. So what happened was that instead of following the normal procedure for amending EU treaties and secondary legislation set out in EU law, there would be a statement that certain things would be done on the date to be determined, in particular the 24th of June, so long as the UK public entitled to vote voted to remain within the European Union. So our first victim is rule of law, because we're not going to follow the rules which we established. We're going to set up something else. The second victim is the imperative of speed requires was democracy, because in effect, what the deal meant was that no national government, no national parliament of the 28 member states would have an opportunity to examine the deal. There would be no formal ratification procedure in accordance with national law in any member state. No one needed to be consulted, and there was no actual act which any head of government or head of state of an EU member state had to do to agree to this statement in international law. And thus, democracy goes out the window. The third victim, of course, is the courts. There will be no possibility of challenge. And finally, the fourth victim, I would say, is the Commission, which, as guardian of the treaties, was not an innocent bystander in this massacre of EU constitutionalism, but in fact was a participant encouraging everyone to abandon the rules of EU law, of their national constitutions, to agree this new settlement for the United Kingdom within the EU. That is the question of monstrous citizenships. And here I want to look at the question of what kind of citizenship is it that the EU has produced which we absolutely do not want here. One consequence of the UK vote to leave the EU is that the approximately 65 million British citizens living anywhere in the world, though most of them live in the UK, will cease to be citizens of the European Union. Nationals of the other 27 member states, the 445 million of them, will continue to be citizens of the European Union. Some British citizens will, of course, have a second passport of another member state. This is the question of how many people are looking for Irish ancestors. And, of course, some nationals of other member states have acquired British citizenship, and they will be able to enjoy the two. But Brexit will be the biggest bonfire of citizenship status in the UK, in UK law, since the independence of the colonies in the mid-20th century, when nationals of the then newly independent states lost, by and large, their status as British. From the 24th of June 2016, the day after the referendum vote, there has been an explosion of racially motivated attacks in the UK. The Institute of Race Relations opened a special web page compiling news reports of these attacks. Many of the attacks have been directed against EU citizens from other member states and were clearly well organised. Others have been directed at British citizens of visible ethnic minorities, and there is, at the moment, no sight of these attacks letting up. They have been deplored by the current and the former British Prime Ministers and many organisations against racism. The vote to cease to be EU citizens appears to have opened the gates of racism long embedded in British debates about who is really British. What is the most important difference between British citizenship and EU citizenship? In my opinion, there's one crucial difference between the two, and that is rights. British citizenship is not based on rights. There is no Bill of Rights. There is no written constitution, and rights attaching to British citizenship seem to come primarily from international law. EU citizenship is created by a treaty, currently the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and is based on specific and stated rights. And the contours of those rights have been the matter of much judicial consideration. If we go back to looking at British citizenship and what is British citizenship, my argument here is going back to the 1960s, one sees that British citizenship has been and continues to be primarily a form of immigration status. The only thing that one acquires because one is a British citizen, as opposed to anything else, is possibly the right to live in the UK. And of course, the right to live in the UK as a British citizen was the one which was most challenged in the 1960s and 70s on the expulsion of the East African Asians. And those of you in the room who will have worked with me on a number of these cases over the years will remember that the British government gave the choice to the East African Asians who'd primarily been moved to East Africa and in the process of the colonization of East Africa by the British, the opportunity to remain British on the independence of their states. And many of them chose to do so. Lord Leicester has estimated that it's about 200,000 of them at that time. And they remained British citizens as opposed to becoming citizens of the newly independent countries because they were afraid of the Africanization policies. And sure enough, the Africanization policies were put into place where they were deprived of their livelihoods, of the possibility of any public service, exclusion from the universities, and exclusion also of property rights. In the most horrific example was 1972, when the president of Uganda threatened to kill any East African Asians who'd not left the country within 90 days of his edict. In 3 days in February 1968, the East African Asians with British passports began to arrive in the UK, and Parliament adopted in those 3 days the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which had the effect of depriving this group of British nationals of the right to enter and reside in the UK on the basis of their race. There was no recourse in the UK. The matter went to the European Court of Human Rights, where it was dealt with by the then European Commission on Human Rights, which found that the treatment was inhuman and degrading by reason of racial discrimination. One of these East African Asians, who by this time, after the British Nationality Act 1981, had been reclassified as a British overseas citizen born in 1949 in Kenya, sought to rely on her right as an EU citizen in 2001 to be able to enjoy the right of free movement in the European Union. The European Court of Justice was unwilling to deal with the matter and said it was a matter for the member states to determine who their nationals were. But the case has come back to haunt us recently in a judgment of the Supreme Court called FAM about deprivation of citizenship, where in the judgment, their justices describe Ms. Carr as a Kenyan citizen of Asian origin. And that transformation of her from basically stateless, but called a British overseas citizen, into a Kenyan citizen is indicative of what happens in that particular judgment, where the Supreme Court decides that they are better placed to determine who is a Vietnamese national than the Vietnamese authorities, and because the man in question in their consideration is Vietnamese, though this is denied by the Vietnamese authorities, the Secretary of State can deprive him of citizenship, which then happened. We have a period of the development of citizenship law in the UK, where it's increasingly obvious that British citizenship is only just another immigration status. And really starting from the 2002 Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act, and then the Immigration, Asylum and Nationality Act 2006, and then the Immigration Act 2014, the powers for the Secretary of State to take citizenship away from British citizens were enlarged, first from those who'd naturalised, and then from people who were born British, with minor limitations on being made stateless. And I think it's worth pausing to examine the titles of these Acts of Parliament. The first one commences with nationality, indicating that there are changes to the status of British citizens which are important. The second amending act has a title which indicates that it's about immigration and asylum primarily, but adds nationality as a third sphere. And the last act is simply an immigration act, citizenship, and the withdrawal, the deprivation of citizenship has become merely another form of immigration. I would also go into the 2015 Act, which will allow the Counterterrorism and Security Act, which allows the exiling of British citizens for up to 2 years as another way of turning citizenship into a form of immigration status. And yet there are no other rights which are exclusively tied to British citizenship. On the other hand, EU citizenship has been moving in exactly the opposite direction. So as the relationship with British citizenship and the right to be in the UK has been highly qualified, EU citizenship has become increasingly determined that EU citizens should be allowed to live in the EU. And in the written text, I go through how that develops through the cases, but in particular, the decision of the Court of Justice that children who are EU citizens, even if they're living in their home member state, are entitled to have their third country national family members with them, because otherwise they would be excluded from the essence of the right of citizenship. And so you have a complete bifurcation between EU citizenship becoming ever more rights-oriented, ever more a citizenship rather than an immigration status, and British citizenship becoming ever more an immigration status and ceasing to have much of any other essence to it. And that seems to have been the source of much of the controversy about these two citizenships in the context of the Brexit campaign. EU citizens mustn't be entitled to this right to live in the EU. They must be retransformed back into immigrants, and they must no longer be able to have this claim to the entitlement to live in the EU, or at least in the UK. What about the Monstrous family, which have not been notified and accepted by those authorities? The state's role in recognising marriage and civil partnerships as worthy of extra protection also forms the basis of rules around what types of marriage or civil partnership will be acknowledged. The struggle for same-sex partners for recognition and state protection of their relationships is a story of the final quarter of the 20th century and the first of the 21st century. Only in 2013 did the UK pass an act allowing same-sex partners to marry. Same-sex marriage has moved in most of Europe and the United States from being a monstrous idea to a signalling issue on the basis of which is determined who are the monsters. Now they are the opponents of same-sex marriage. While the gender of parties to a marriage has become increasingly unimportant in the UK and the EU, their citizenship and immigration status has become ever more important. The idea that foreigners are seeking to avoid deportation or removal from the UK by getting married, and so ever more coercive action needs to be taken by the authorities to prevent such abuse, has moved into mainstream logic. What is it that is so monstrous about EU family reunion law? Well, it is the fact that it's based on rights, an entitlement to have your family members with you, an entitlement to social benefits if you are a worker, no obligations to fulfill language tests and other obligations, and no duty to pay very substantial fees. So what are the reasons why foreign family members are monstrous to the UK authorities? Well, the first seems to be because they're a foreigner, and therefore they're likely to want to cheat the ever more coercive immigration system. Secondly, they're dangerous, as they and their spouses may be poor and seek social benefits, and so they will have to have a mandatory income of at least £18,600 a year, where income support levels for a couple is £5,972.20 a year. They might work, thus taking a job from a British citizen, according to the zero-sum game fallacy about labour markets, which successive British governments pander to. And they may, as well, fourthly, they may have dependents and grandparents who they're going to want to bring to the UK. Under EU rules, they will not have to pay the high fees. An application for a spouse visa is now at £1,195. And if they are marrying an EU national, there can be no interrogation into the reasons for the marriage, though there is a prohibition on sham marriages. So in the Brexit negotiations, the UK demanded, and the Council and the Commission agreed to a revision of the rules on family reunification. And it would apply first and foremost to British citizens seeking to come back to the UK with their monstrous family members after having lived in another member state. They would no longer be entitled to do so if the Brexit vote had gone to remain, and thus these monstrous families could continue to contaminate other member states, but they couldn't come back and contaminate the UK. My final section is about the monstrous fears. And Michael Gove, the former British Justice Minister and one of the leaders of the Leave campaign, was quoted in a newspaper friendly to his views that revealing research from the Vote Leave campaign, the official lead Brexit campaign, Mr. Gove said that anywhere between 2.6 and 5 million extra EU migrants could come to the UK by 2030. Mr. Gove said 88 million extra people would be granted the right to live and work in Britain due to the EU's commitment to Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Turkey all joining the bloc. The comparison I want to make is between two kinds of statement. The first appears ridiculous to any British citizen, and that is 64.1 million people living in the UK are entitled to move, even tomorrow if they wish, to Oxford, a town of 150,000. This would swamp the town, creating massive housing, schooling, and health service shortages. This statement immediately appears odd and out of kilter. Yes, the population of the UK has the right to move to Oxford if it so wishes, but no one expects that to happen or thinks that measures need to be taken to stop them doing so. The other statement is that of the former Justice Minister. The 88 million inhabitants of the accession states will in the future all be entitled to move to the UK and take jobs. Now, this statement does not seem so monstrous. Instead, it appears to demand a reasoned response. Someone is expected to explain how what has now been transformed into a threat, free movement of persons, can be controlled and prevented. Between the two statements, a profound shift of logic has occurred. The possibility of the whole of the UK moving to Oxford is obviously silly, and the reader is immediately encouraged to think of the practical problems. The people who might be moving to Oxford are the equivalent of the readers, and we do not expect our behaviour to be bizarre. Yet the possibility of the whole populations of 5 countries moving to the UK does not share the same logic. The fear at work is that those people are different from us. They may behave in bizarre manners. The further fear which is generated is that because they are different, of implicit poverty, moving to the UK might be a reasonable option for them, where moving to Oxford is not for us. The core difference between the two statements is that the first rests on an accepted idea that citizens are entitled to move freely within their state. The second rests on the idea that EU citizens and future citizens are not and never will be real citizens. The threat being expressed is that free movement of people within the territory of the EU is a monstrous right which must be curtailed before havoc occurs. I'm just going to turn to my final comments on where I think we may in the end go, and that means that I'm going to skip over one of my favourite bits about the monstrous experts. Being a monstrous expert, I particularly like that part. But you'll have to read it in the text when it's printed. So, what do I think is likely to happen? Well, the referendum is over, and the result, though not overwhelming, has been accepted by all the institutions as binding. One might consider this somewhat odd when both Ireland twice and the Danes once have been invited to think and vote again. When the people of those two countries did reconsider their negative EU votes, they changed their minds, but no such option is available for the British. And neither the British government nor the EU institutions nor any member state are even entertaining that idea. The constitutional debate in the UK about who can trigger Article 50 looks like it's going to be short-circuited by the government, taking the move in early January without a bill, an act of Parliament, and perhaps with only very minor consultation with the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. Since the Brexit vote, there has been, of course, the drop of the pound in value against the euro. The Bank of England, according to its governor, who gave evidence to Parliament on the 7th of September, has taken exceptional measures to ensure liquidity and to avoid a market slump. And in the longer term, these measures are likely to lead to a rise in inflation. At the council meeting in Bratislava on the 16th of September, the UK was not invited. And the first line of the conclusions from that council meeting was the 27 member states are making the decisions. For the moment, there's no public information on the position of the British government on any issue of the departure from the EU. The British media is generally fairly triumphalist about the referendum outcome, and one is reminded of the thesis of Conor Garrity's book, Fantasy Island, on the UK and human rights. A resolute refusal to acknowledge the obvious seems to be particularly enduring characteristic for much of the UK media. The Scots tend to call this thinking pink, a reference to the mindset expressed by pre-1960 world maps, where large parts of the world are coloured pink, evidencing their status as British colonies. When the Governor of the Bank of England gave evidence to the House of Commons Treasury Committee on the 7th of September, he was subject to a variety of insults by members of Parliament for his forecast that the Leave vote would harm the economy. So we live in a period of time where we're fairly confident that leaving the EU is going to be, not only it's going to happen, but it will not be a bad idea. The current Prime Minister has consistently refused to give any comfort to non-British EU citizens. Living closely to the United States remains uncertain. At the Bratislava Council meeting of 16 September, new priorities of the EU were set out, one of which is internal and external security. It is unlikely external security would have been on the table, let alone selected as a priority, if the British negotiators had been there. It raises the thorny question of the relationship of NATO with the EU, most unwelcome to US interests. Some member states have traditionally favoured a strengthening of European defence capacity outside NATO, which is the subtext of the external security, and many of the Central and Eastern European countries, in light of in particular the Ukraine events, are eager to follow that route. The UK has traditionally been a strong supporter of NATO, and the question will be, is the UK going to be able to defend the interests of the US for a NATO-led alternative in respect of external security? or is the EU going to move somewhere else? The integrity of the UK appears to be on hold at the moment. The Scottish Nationalist Party's leader, Nicola Sturgeon, has let it be known that the UK's departure from the EU may be a reason to trigger a second independence referendum, so that Scotland could remain in the EU. But I was looking at the Scottish Parliament debate 3 days ago on the issue, and this is not one of the top issues which was discussed then. Rather more quietly, some discussions have been taking place between actors in Northern Ireland and the Republic about how to manage Brexit, not least regarding border controls and security. It is still early days following the referendum, but one thing is clear. The UK is set to leave the EU. The UK's participation in an EU project based on free movement of goods, persons, services and capital will soon be over. The British political and public gaze is likely to become more internally and US focused. Once again, in the British imagination, the continent is likely to be cut off because of fog in the Channel. Thank you very much for your attention.
I intend to move on fairly quickly to the discussants because they have a meagre 10 minutes to give their impressions of a lecture which was extremely rich, and I've been instructed to enforce the time limits with a Juncker-like severity. We turn first to Professor Mitzel. Sorry, I can't say that nicely. Professor Mitzel, who's the head of the Department of Law here, with whom many of you will be familiar. He's the Professor of European Criminal Law and Director of the Criminal Justice Centre, and he too specialises in the fields of migration, asylum and borders, and very pertinently I see that your most recent book was The Criminalisation of Migration in Europe. So he's going to speak on the Brexit negotiations between the British government and the European Union.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you, Elspeth, for this wonderful speech, which was very sophisticated and very insightful on a very, very complex legal and political issue. I must say, I'm sure I share this view with a number of you in the audience, that Elspeth always makes me think outside the box and opens new avenues of inquiry. One of the first things that I've read of you many years ago was your inaugural in Nijmegen, which in 2001, which was entitled Moving the Borders of Europe, which was really a first-class account of the transformation of citizenship and identity in European Union law, and which has really influenced my thinking in the field, and I'm sure the thinking of many others in the audience. And I think this inaugural has certainly matched this in terms of innovation and originality. And I must say that as someone who is interested in these issues, but also as a colleague and in my hat as head of the law school here, I must say how happy and proud I am that you are a member of our department. So I think that it is great to have you here, and it's great for all of us to have the privilege to listen to your inaugural. In my 7 minutes left, my task, as Carol said, is to comment on monstrous negotiations. And my take on this will not be so much on what this means for the UK, but rather what this means for the European Union and for the European constitutional order. And I think Brexit should be viewed in the context of a very old question which remains very pertinent in European integration, whether the widening and the deepening of the European Union remains mutually exclusive or whether it can be combined. And underlying this, something that no one really talks about in terms of the EU, because I think everybody's trying to absorb still the Brexit shock, is whether a Europe a la carte can survive? And I think that's a key question, not only for the UK, which, as Elspeth said, may end up being Brexiting and being outside the EU, but also for those who remain or who will remain in the European Union. So I want to give you some legal context behind the negotiations and just give you a very brief outline of the legal position of the United Kingdom with regard to EU law before Mr. Cameron announced that a referendum would take place and before he went to try to negotiate with the European leaders about further concessions regarding the position of the UK. First of all, as we all know, and those of you who travel to the UK is not a part of the borderless Schengen area. So when the Schengen acquis was integrated within the EU law in the Treaty of Amsterdam, the United Kingdom just declared that it will retain its own border controls. It's a matter of sovereignty. So the UK wanted to have its cake and eat it by participating in the police part of Schengen, so being able to profit from the security integration within the Schengen area, but without really abolishing its border controls. So that's the first step. We are sovereign and we don't want to have anything to do with this. This exclusion, if you like, has been extended in the whole field of EU immigration law. By EU immigration law, as Elspeth, I do not mean EU citizenship, but I mean the law that concerns third country nationals. And there, when this policy was, as we called it in this horrible term, communitarized by the entry into force of the Amsterdam Treaty, the United Kingdom has inserted an opt-out, which gave it a case-by-case participation right to every single secondary law instrument the EU would propose in the field of immigration. The record of the UK in the field is interesting. It has not opted into any or very little of the EU legislation giving rights to migrants, and that, I think, chimes quite well with what Elspeth was talking about, but it has tried to participate to all the security measures, all the enforcement measures, all the EU measures that are deemed to target irregular migration. So that's a partial participation there. It's all about sovereignty. We don't want to give rights to third country nationals, to foreigners who are here to claim our benefits. Those of you who were here in June and made me the honor of attending my overdue inaugural on European criminal justice know that the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon and the Lisbonization of criminal justice meant that this opt-out of the UK was extended in the field of security and crime, which meant that the United Kingdom had a case-by-case right to participate or not in EU measures on criminal justice. And if you look at the record now, you know that the record is very similar in the field, to the field of immigration law, which means that the UK has indeed participated in a number of measures which had to do with law enforcement, including the European Arrest Warrant framework decision, but has declined to participate by a number of key measures giving rights to the defendant. A scandalous omission is the directive of the EU on the right to access to a lawyer for defense rights, and it is scandalous not because only of the fact that the UK has not participated in a measure which introduces in EU law standards which are and many times lower than the actual UK standards in the field, but mostly because the main reason for the UK's opt-out has been the fear of the European Court of Justice. The Minister has stated in Parliament that we accept that it's easy for us to implement the EU standard domestically, but we do not want the European judges to tell us what to do. It's all about sovereignty. Again, we all know about it, of course, the non-entry of the UK into the Eurozone is a matter of sovereignty, but also the sovereignty debate has led into the introduction into the Lisbon Treaty for the first time, of a clause that everybody's talking about today, for the first time giving the opportunity to a member state to withdraw from the European Union, with European integration no longer being irreversible, and maybe, why not, an ever closer union no longer being irreversible. So I want you to look at the current situation in the light of this and to pose you the question, was really Brexit a matter of time? I mean, all these years we were trying to grapple with the UK peculiarity and saying, yes, but everybody else is part of this, but the UK has its own reasons. It has its own reasons, but these reasons have a spillover effect, and this is what we have seen, I think, in the Brexit debate. The paradox of all of this, so the UK has been saying no to a lot of EU law, and Tony Blair, in a wonderful statement in the House of Commons, I think many years ago, he said, this is the pick and choose Europe that we all want. The pick and choose Europe may not really be very easy to sustain, but in this negativity over time, there's a very big paradox, a very big contrast, because the UK has said a big yes, actually, to EU citizenship by being one of the very few EU member states which did not impose transitional periods of free movement to the Eastern European countries which entered the EU in 2004. And maybe this has come to bite in the Brexit referendum. Yes. But I think that it's important also to think in that way. So on the one hand, we do not want anything that the EU does in the fields of migration and borders and crime and the currency, because it's close to sovereignty. On the other hand, we accept expansion of citizenship rights on the basis of free movement and citizenship, because we believe, at least, in the single market, which poses the question that Ms. May has led us to ask. Brexit means Brexit, but what does Brexit mean? Can we have a Brexit? Can we still be in the single market without having free movement and without having citizenship rights? And that's a very big question, and I think ultimately I tend to agree with Elspeth that it may prove to be irreconcilable, but no one really wants to admit it at this stage. But we will see. So, have a look at what's going on now in the light of what has happened before legally and constitutionally, and forget about the political rhetoric. And the question is, was Brexit inevitable or not? Elspeth has drawn attention to the process when speaking about monstrous negotiations. And I think this is a very important section of your speech, and it's very important, I think, for us to pay attention to that, because the way in which negotiations were handled was not unique in recent years, and there's a worrying tendency, I think, to move away from European rule of law and from European democracy. Every time we perceive, it is perceived that there is a problem in the EU, there is, coming from a particular member state, there is an effort to put this member state into quarantine or in isolation. And we saw it very prominently also with the Greek Eurozone saga, where again we had this rhetoric that this will not be dealt by EU institutions, this will be dealt by the European Council and by leaders of EU member states individually. And I think that I was very struck by being reminded by you about the role that the European Council has played in that. The European Council is a relatively new EU institution in the treaties. It is the heads of state. It has much more limited accountability in relation to the other EU institutions, and you mentioned the Commission, but I would also mention even the Council of Ministers, but in particular the European Parliament, which has played a very minimal role to all of this. And I think so far we have seen an attempt to insulate from EU law and to insulate both by excluding the institutions and by excluding EU law in itself and using international law in the Euro crisis, in the Brexit crisis, and also in the refugee crisis. And let's remember that the EU-Turkey agreement currently is an agreement based on international law, and there's a very big debate about its legal value and effect. In my final minute, I just want to say two things. First of all, I think rightly Elspeth has pointed out the challenges that the Brexit saga has brought within not only citizenship in this country, but for EU and European democracy and rule of law. And I think in this context, these discussions are a missed opportunity, because by shielding this whole issue from a debate, a democratic debate within Europe, you just avoid the discussion and the decision maybe about the vision about what the European Union should become. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Professor Douglas Scott holds the anniversary chair in law here and is also co-director of the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. And she's a constitutional lawyer who writes very often on human rights and is currently a member of a large-scale research project on European citizenship, which is funded by the European Commission.
How much longer?
2 years completed, and is investigating barriers that EU citizens encounter in the exercise of their rights and obligations, on which subject she is now going to give us her views.
Well, I'm going to stay seated here as well. And thank you so much for that wonderful lecture, Elspeth. Academics aren't always practicing lawyers, but I had a look at your website, or sites I should say, before I came, and you do so many things, and of course being a partner in a law firm as well. And I saw some wonderful sites for you. You're described somewhere as a super brain on EU law, and I'm sure we've seen evidence of that this evening. But practitioners don't always use the flair and imagination that you have this evening. They don't always cite Marina Warner on Monstrous, for example, and I found that aspect of your lecture absolutely fascinating. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit in my remaining 9 minutes or whatever on citizenship and the British Constitution. And I very much liked your phrase that Brexit will be the biggest bonfire of citizenship status in UK law since the independence of the colonies in the second half of the 20th century. And I think you showed very clearly the distinction in the concept of citizenship that people have worked with in the past in the UK, and the difference with the idea of European citizenship. And I suppose my first response to that would be, well, in a sense, how could it be otherwise? If you look at the history of British citizenship, as you say, people have been subjects. And I think it was only with the 1948 Nationality Act that the idea of citizenship even emerged and found its place on British passports. So subjecthood, that's the concept that's been applying in law. And I went and had a look at some of our great canonical authors of British constitutional law, Justice Cook and Blackstone, and the talk there is all of allegiance and subjecting yourself to the monarch. It's a very, very different way of looking at citizenship than the ideas that emerged in the French Revolution, or indeed much, much longer ago in the ancient city-states in Greece. So this is what we in Britain have had to work with for a surprisingly long time. Right up until the 19th century, there's plenty of case law that's working with this idea of subjecthood. So this is the citizenship, this is the idea of Britishness that people are working with. And when they talk about taking back control and more of a British identity, this is it. Now, when I was reading your lecture, I was at the same time reading a wonderful book by Linda Colley called Britons, Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, which may be known to some people here, and if it isn't, I strongly recommend it. And Linda Colley reminds us that actually Britain came into being pretty recently, in 1707, with the Acts of Union of Scotland and England. And she draws on various concepts that have been very, very foundational in forging the British nation. The idea of empire and trade, Protestantism, monarchy, wars with a continental European other. And I just wanted to pick up on three of these and relate them to some of the things that you've been saying in your lecture, because I think there's something very atavistic in the taking back control and the idea of asserting a British identity, from the recommissioning of the Royal Yacht Britannia to the idea of more grammar schools. Something is going on in identity terms there. So nationhood and citizenship. I think what I find interesting in Brexit is how so many identities are being ignored. Even within what we would call Britain itself, the devolved nations. There was an amendment put to Parliament when the Referendum Act was going through, that there should be a requirement of a majority of votes in all four of the nations of the United Kingdom. That didn't succeed, and David Cameron famously said, "We are one United Kingdom, there will be one in-out referendum, and that will be decided on a majority of those who vote." So on this view, Scotland's or Northern Ireland's vote to remain in the UK has no constitutional relevance. But these are citizens, these are peoples, and maybe we should be thinking about British peoples rather than a British people. Secondly, something else that Linda Colley mentions is the monarchy. And it's easy to not make a big thing about the monarchy, but in a sense, since 1707, this is one of the elements of the Constitution that hasn't changed so much. And of course, it has its ceremonial and pageantry functions, but it also helps perpetuate this self-definition, this definition of British citizenship as subjecthood. We are subjects still of the Crown, and naturalised British citizens take an oath when they become British. Who is the oath to? It is to the monarch. Interestingly, a little bit of research, I discovered that Sophia, Electress and Duchess Dowager of Hanover, well, we have to go back to for our current hereditary status in monarchy. All of our current kings and queens have been descended from her, would not have qualified for British citizenship because she was from Hanover. They actually had to pass a Naturalisation Act back in 1705, I think, to render her British. But I find this is all rather ironic because very often the arguments that were being made against the EU were how undemocratic it is. It suffers from a democratic deficit. And yet here we are with an unelected head of state of German origin, married to a Greek, and this in a country which is resisting migrants, as the term is becoming. It's Her Majesty's government, not the people's. Surely for true citizenship, it should be a people's government. And ministers retain powers under the royal prerogative, left over from days when they really were the king or the queen's ministers. And this very issue, of course, is going to be litigated in October in what some people have called our biggest constitutional case on the question of how exactly is Article 50 triggered. How does Britain leave the EU? Can Prime Minister May simply do this through executive action, through the prerogative, or must there be a vote in Parliament or an Act of Parliament? So again, this relates, I think, closely to citizenship. Seeing yourself as a subject in this context brings about a very different notion of citizenship. Finally, another element that Linda Colley picked on was wars against continental Europe. Firstly, against France in the 18th and 19th century, then against Germany in the 20th century. Thankfully, these are over, but they have left a very bitter heresy of Euroscepticism, which we find in very much of our press. And no wonder it was so hard to make a positive case for the EU in the context of the referendum, when Europe has for so long been seen as an other and continues to be portrayed in that way. No wonder then, too, that European citizenship would be seen as this monstrous application. I find it very interesting what you say about rights versus subjecthood. But the problem is that even these rights are proving relatively easy to get rid of. Eventually, it will be an act of parliament that will deprive British citizens of their European citizenship, just as the East African Asians were deprived of theirs. In the same way, perhaps next in this bonfire will be the Human Rights Act, and more rights will go that way. And again, there is something almost nostalgic and retrospective about this movement, an aim to get back to a former bygone age when Parliament was sovereign, and Parliament could, by legislation, change the legal situation quite radically. So just those three things that I wanted to highlight, but in conclusion, these major elements that have went into forging the British nation from the 18th century are still surprisingly present with us today, and are still currency that people make use of quite a bit. The very unwritten British Constitution is called into this play. It is our unwritten Constitution that has made it so easy for an unbinding referendum to bring about radical changes, perhaps even simply by executive action, that would destroy the identity of Britain itself if Scotland and Northern Ireland go. So there's something paradoxical there. Conclude with something I found Marina Warner had said. She said that the account of the 6 myths of our time demonstrates we are in danger of managing monsters only in crude terms of the violent film or video game, that is, by slaying others, in which process we effectively are destroying the richness of our own inner lives, and so destroying ourselves. And she advocates a more subtle, traditional approach to the monstrous other: negotiation, sympathy, understanding. And I fear that there's been all too little of that in the context of Brexit.
Professor Kees Groenendijk is an emeritus professor of sociology, a change from all the lawyers, and sociology of law at the University of Nijmegen. I've never been able to say that, have I? And the chairman of its Centre for Migration Law. But I think I know him better as chairman of the Netherlands Standing Committee of Experts on International Immigration, Refugee and Criminal Law, usually known as the Myers Committee. Kees has done much work on the impact of law and social policy on immigrants, and he's going to consider the impact of uncertainty about citizenship and legal status on immigrants and their family members, or so I understand.
Thank you. It is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to see a former PhD student giving her second inaugural lecture. And it was really a rich and insightful lecture. But I've also mixed feelings today. This possibly is the last full year that my right to speak freely and work at a UK university is protected by EU law. Whatever I say here today, no one at the Home Office can order me to leave. Is not conducive to the public good. And I can work in a UK university as an external examiner or as a researcher. This month I got an email from an officer of this university which told me, and I quote, QMUL is unable to appoint examine ability to work in the UK. In my view, the bureaucratic wall that after Brexit will isolate academics in the UK to the detriment of people at both sides of this bureaucratic wall. The subject chosen by Professor Gaalt is most topical. The decision of the heads of government of February probably will never legally enter into force. Nevertheless, that decision may well influence the behavior of EU institutions such as the Commission or the Court, and it could very well influence the behavior of member states in negotiations on the Brexit. In February, all 28 member states, at least their governments represented in the Council, wanted to avoid amending the treaties. But a Brexit will make amending of the treaties unavoidable and could provide an opportunity for the remaining 27 member states to codify some of the disastrous elements of the February decision. So I hope they will read the written version of your lecture. I would like to make 3 remarks with regard to the part on the monstrous families. And my first remark is that you focus on the UK, but Britain was not alone in its efforts of EU nationals. That was present, that right that was present in free movement law from the very the EEC and the EU. There always have been unification. The French-German tradition, which was based on written constitutions explicitly protecting tradition, where there is no constitutional guarantee of the right of a family to live together. And in a long line of judgments of the Court of Justice regarding the right to family life that you describe in the written version of your lecture, apparently the French and German tradition prevailed. But the UK and the Netherlands have persistently campaigned against that line, until very recently in vain. In 2008, shortly after the Mattock judgment, that the UK and the Netherlands in the Council of Ministers tried to overrule that judgment for its minority in Parliament on the votes of the MPs of the Geert Wilders party, in a written proposal, proposed to reduce the right of family reunifications of EU nationals to the far lower right of family reunification of third country nationals under the Family Reunification Directive. That effort failed as well. There was little support of other member states, probably also of the relation with the Geert Wilders party. In 2013, these 2 member states were able to enlist support of 2 others, as you mentioned in your written text, Germany and Austria. But again, these 4 member states failed to get support, enough support in the Council. And the irony is that now at a time when the UK is on the point of leaving the EU, the British-Dutch position tends to prevail. And all member states have seduced the Commission to make a proposal to codify the British and Dutch position in EU law. Secondly, there's a certain paradox. Since the beginning of this century, the EU Council of Ministers, and after the Lisbon Treaty, together with the European Parliament, has adopted a series of directives, as Professor Mitzel already mentioned, on the legal position, the legal status and the rights of third country nationals in the member states. The Family Reunification Directive, a directive on long-term residence, the Students Directive, highly qualified workers directive, and at least 6 others. The UK has not opted in to any of these directives. When drafting these directives, the rights of EU citizens under free movement law served as a kind of model. The third country nationals didn't get the same rights. Surely they got less rights than EU citizens, but the rights-based model of EU nationals was introduced in the directive and was confirmed in a series of judgments by the Court of Justice. In the February decision, we see the opposite development. The rights of EU nationals are now modeled after the rights of third country nationals, or made fully dependent on national immigration law. EU nationals, like you rightly say, become more aliens and less citizens. The consequence would be that that third country nationals in the 25 member states bound by the Family Reunification Directive will have more rights to live with their family members under EU law than the mobile EU nationals, who would depend on national law or discretion of the state's officers. This situation will be problematic both politically and legally. The differentiation in treatment, treating EU nationals worse than third country nationals, is hardly compatible with Article 8 and Article 14 of the European Convention of Human Rights. But it may result in political pressure to reduce, level down the rights to family reunification of third country nationals in the Family Reunification Directive. Now my last point. I want to draw your attention to the question, who will be hit by a future decision, like the one in the February decision, to abolish the right to family reunification. This is, in your lecture, you touch upon it only marginally. You suggest something, but I think we should give a clear answer to that question. Workers or self-employed nationals of other member states with high education or income, and probably most students, will not be bothered, since they usually are able to meet the national law requirements. But workers with lower income, who will have to take an additional job to meet the national income requirements, they will be hit. And EU nationals of immigrant origin will be hit far more often than native EU nationals by the national rules. Firstly, because they are more mobile, because they have more often friends, contacts, family relationships in other member states, and because they will marry far more often than native EU nationals with spouses from outside the EU. It is no coincidence that many of the relevant Court of Justice judgments relate to cases of UK, Dutch and Belgian nationals of immigrant origin, as is indicated by their names: Surrender Singh, Morson Onyanyan, Eind, Diatta, and the first similar case that was decided by the EFTA court in July this year was a case of a spouse of a Norwegian national with a family name Yabi, which is a typical Gambian family name. The propensity of EU nationals of immigrant origin to use their free movement rights far more than the other EU nationals was very well illustrated by data released last week by the Dutch official agency for statistics. They reported that over the last years, 1 in 7 of the persons who received Dutch nationality by naturalization left the Netherlands within 2 years after becoming Dutch citizens. Some of them to return to with the Dutch nationality to their country of origin, but many of them to move to other member states, UK, Germany or Belgium. By the Dublin rules in the Netherlands, and they wanted to go to another member state, and they had to wait until they were naturalized so that they could move, but also because they were confronted with discrimination in employment at the Dutch labor market, and thought that they had more perspective in other member states. Abolishing the right to family reunification for EU nationals would add to a tendency in several member states to treat nationals of immigrant origin as second class, not real citizens, with, in my view, nefast consequences for their integration. When the protection of EU law against such treatment is taken away. And my only hope is that now you have given 2 inaugural lectures, that you will keep one leg in London, but remain to keep the other leg on the continent.
Before I move to thank all the speakers, I just have some information for Case. I was born within the sound of Bow Bells, which is the traditional way to know a Londoner. And I was asked by the London School of Economics, where I have taught for 35 years, to prove my right to teach in the United Kingdom. That seems a rather depressing note on which to end a splendid lecture that we've heard, which was impressive and managed to cover an enormous amount in a horribly short time. And I can recommend to the audience to read the lecture, which is much richer still. We've also had the benefit of some very concise and pithy observations from 3 very well-informed commentators. So anything I could add would be superfluous, and I have one single comment. Elspeth, I am Welsh, and I am going to found a society for the protection of dragons. They are So I have one more pleasant job, to invite everyone to attend a drinks reception in the foyer of the People's Palace, which will allow you to ask all the questions that I have wickedly suppressed.